Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Just lots of people taking their seats. Welcome to the second in our series of Breakfast with Arup. Welcome to all of you joining us online. And welcome to those select few that have joined us in the office as well. I think it's great, finally, we're kind of back to at least hybrid events. So, intrepid travellers, thank you for making the effort to come and join us. Those of you at home, hope you've got a cup of coffee and a croissant and make yourselves comfortable. So yes, this is our second event exploring the theme of net zero carbon. In the first event, we looked at the cost of net zero for a typical office building, and we finished that event with a provocation. And the provocation was that we can't get to net zero carbon simply by applying a lean approach, pursuing marginal gains on conventional assets. We need a bolder approach. We need to do things differently. And that's the theme that we're going to pick up on today. So we've got 4 speakers. They're each going to provide us with their personal perspective, what they think the opportunities and the challenges are in terms of getting to net zero carbon. What are the barriers? How are we going to overcome them? So we're we're anticipating a lively Q&A. So if you're online, you should have access to the chat. Please do post your questions in the chat. If you're in the room, you can post your questions in the normal way by putting your hands up. So if you see me occasionally looking at my screen, I'm not checking my emails or anything. I am actually trying to look at the questions that are coming in online. So to introduce our panelists, we have Adam Smith from Stanhope. So I've had the pleasure of working with Adam over the last 5 to 6 years, and Adam's really been quite influential in terms of steering Stanhope's approach to ESG over that time. Adam is a development manager at Stanhope, chartered architect with a background in sustainable design and master planning. I was trying to remember the name of the architecture firm you work with, Adam. It was Arup something, wasn't
like
it?
That,
something
yes.
like that,
Yeah.
I can't remember. Anyway. Currently leading Oxford North, a mixed-use scheme delivering 1 million square feet of offices, labs, hotel amenities. And he's regularly involved in cross-industry collaboration, bodies such as UK GBC, BCO, and on ESG matters. So that's Adam. Jeremy Edwards. I think it's fair to say Jeremy is as passionate about engineering excellence as he is about the people that deliver it. Jeremy is our UK IMEA property leader, a structural engineer by background, and account manager for a number of our key clients. Passionate about holistic design and how we integrate ideas and teams to deliver world-class projects, including the building that we're all sat in now, as well as other buildings like 8 Bishopsgate, and the 2019 BCO Best of the Best at 2 Television Centre. And then we have Anne Delzell. It says here that Anne's been building services engineer for more than 30 years, but I can't. That must be a misprint, Anne. I don't think that can be right.
Sadly not.
So Anne brings a real passion for sustainability and decarbonisation to her role as an associate director. Trained as a building services engineer, today she's increasingly focused on achieving the lowest carbon outcome for both new buildings and refurbishments. Extensive experience of engineering design, particularly in education and arts sectors. Alongside development projects, Anne is increasingly working with landlords and tenants defining portfolio level decarbonisation roadmaps. And then last but not least, Lorna Edwards from RSHP. So I think we listened to the rehearsals earlier, and I think Lorna's dedication to architecture is clear from the fact that her case study in the presentation is her own house. So, it's nothing like taking your work home with you, Lorna. So Lorna's associate partner at Roger Stirk, Harbour and Partners, experience of stakeholder consultation, pragmatic approach, and fosters collaborative working with clients, consultants, contractors, and we've enjoyed working with Lorna over many years. Also a core member of RSHP's sustainability group. Lorna's currently working on a major extension to the British Library. Previous projects include the British Museum World Conservation and Exhibition Centre and the London School of Economics Centre building. So that's our panel. Looking forward to some exciting provocations, some good questions. So please don't wait till the end. People online, please do post your questions. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Adam.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Arup for inviting me to this event. It's much nicer being in person than sort of staring into the black hole of a Talking Heads forum in my man cave in my garden. So it's great to see you all. It's also a little bit intimidating. There's a lot of former bosses, colleagues, clients, consultants here. Originally, when I agreed to do this, I thought I was coming over for a quick croissant and a coffee to talk about carbon with Jeremy. But I found out I had to do some slides a couple of days ago. So forgive me if this is a high level view. I think the first thing that I'd like to get to my slides. Upside down. Thank you. My theme is really, I suppose, this sort of slight anxiety that myself and my colleagues, particularly Nils Raj, who's now head of ESG at Stanhope, have about the risk of groupthink and oversimplification that we're seeing around net zero. There's a real rush to reach for benchmarks and targets and rating systems and signing up to this badge or the other. And I think that we always have to critique those things as we go along. And so I think that's the overarching theme that I'd like to talk about. My provocation is that in pursuit of net zero, developers are being pushed to adopt universal target systems, such as science-based targets and the Reba and Letty benchmarks. But is this the most appropriate approach, or do we need to look at the bigger picture? I think we often, as developers and designers, like to draw metaphors and parallels with the car industry in our pursuit of doing things more efficiently. And I think there's another side to this. We're all familiar with the reputational problems that Volkswagen have had in recent years. And I think it's laudable that they're now publishing graphs like this on their website to try and be transparent about what they're selling. This is a graph about the whole life carbon of a diesel car versus electric cars. Some of you have probably seen it or used it in your own presentations, but just to sort of try and explain it quickly to those who haven't seen it before, the lower dark blue bars in the stack chart are the production emissions, the equivalent of the embodied carbon emissions we look at in buildings up front in our A1 to A5 emissions. You then have the well to tank emissions, which you can see on the majority of graphs are quite high. Then you have the tank to wheel emissions, which are very, very thin, so you can't really see them, and the recycling is also very small. The only vehicle that's doing really well is the electric car that is powered purely from wind power. All of the cars that are powered by the blends of fuel that create electricity to the right really don't fare very well. They are generally comparable with the diesel car, but as you can see from the next graph, it takes an awful long time until they break even. And I think we should really think about this when we're doing buildings, whether we're considering to refurbish or knock down and build again, because it's fantastic to be in buildings like this that are all electric and have good REGO certificates behind them to buy renewable energy, but not everyone can do that. And we have to be able to work together as a community of designers and developers that we can develop processes and systems that are not just for grade A office buildings. So this was one example where a project that I actually worked with Arup on. I shall rename Nameless for client purposes, but this was comparing closed cavity facade systems with typical double glazed unit facade systems on a tall office building. And what these graphs show is that over their whole life, the graph on the right, the closed cavity facade system, which is an integrated system with 3 layers of glass and integrated blinds to help with solar gain and so on, doesn't really perform a lot better than the double glazed unit. And when you consider that graph is based on the CCF being used all the time and people not overriding it to get the view, it's a bit worrying. And so I think when we're looking at high-tech solutions, we really need to challenge ourselves about, are we making the right decision? You're nothing in the net zero world without really getting on top of your data and being transparent about it and telling everybody what you're doing. I think there's an awful lot of labelling of net zero schemes. They're all going to have to come clean at some point in what their actual performance is telling us. So I think we're very cautious at Stanhope about marketing buildings as net zero before they've proved themselves in use. We're, as many of you are, involved in Neighbours Pioneer schemes, the accreditation system we're importing from Australia to show performance in use. And you can see that, new build, mid-rise buildings fare well. On energy use, refurbs, it's more challenging, and high-rise is, as ever, very difficult. Similarly, on our embodied carbon, performance, high-rise, very challenging. Refurbs are your get-out-of-jail card on a portfolio basis. And so I think that's the privilege, I suppose, developers who have lots of projects have, is that we can argue our net zero pathways on a portfolio basis. Again, not everyone can do that. So we are looking hard at science-based targets. We've been looking hard at it for about 4 years. And I know that some of the other developers in the room are already signed up to it, and congratulate them on that. I think where we're struggling with it a little bit, to be open and honest with everyone, is that our pipeline fluctuates. Our office emissions of our actual business, if you were very strict about science-based targets, are very, very small. They're less than 1% of our footprint. But because we work with a lot of different shareholders and investors, our pipeline is, fortunately very large, and we have therefore a huge responsibility to manage and declare that carbon footprint. And so I hope you'll see that I'm talking from the micro to the macro here, that the opportunities around net zero carbon and challenges for us are managing the whole ecosystem. Just to give you a bit more insight, you can see here that our embodied carbon in construction is by far and away our biggest issue. And taking our emissions down in absolute terms, which is what science-based targets demands, is actually potentially impossible for us, because we would like to think that our business is growing. It may not, there's no guarantees, but it's very difficult for us to commit to absolute emissions if our floor areas, both under construction and under management, are growing. And so we're seriously questioning whether we can strictly adopt a science-based targets approach for our portfolio, or whether we have to adopt its principles and be open and transparent and manage things on an intensity basis only. So I'll just close with this slide, and I think it sort of relates to this point about whether, whether it's correct that we need to every single company needs to absolutely reduce its emissions. I think one of the issues we've got is that the gulf between the Committee on Climate Change reports and what we're doing at building level is massive. I don't know how many people here have tried to open and read one of these Committee on Climate Change reports, but they are some distance from the practicalities of delivering a building. But I think the good news is, as I'm told, the UK GBC pathway, carbon pathway for the industry, should help us begin to bridge that gap. I think that's me. So just closing, sorry, going back to my original anxieties and the electric cars, is there a danger that in procuring and buying all these net zero in operation buildings that we're actually accelerating climate change through the additional purchase of aluminium and openable windows and heat pumps? And do we absolutely need to reduce emissions for every single company if the share of the market that company is taking is increasing and that they're doing it responsibly?
Thank you very much, Adam. It's really interesting listening to that issue about how we connect what we're doing at this net zero badge that we're all after for a building versus actually what that means when you scale up to the economy. Thanks very much. Jeremy.
Thanks, Adam. It's personally exciting for me to see you all here today. This is a building that was 10 years kind of for me personally working on, and to see real people come into it and explore it and take a look at it, see what they think, that's just exciting. So yes, we're here to talk about net zero carbon and how we might get there, but actually for me it's nice to see you come into the building. My provocation is that I think there's a confusion at a project level that's starting to creep into our decision making around carbon, and really can you avoid that confusion? What I've tried to do is have a think about some of the sort of steps and process on a project level to carbon decision making that I find give me a little bit of clarity, and then I kind of tried to test that against some of the things that I observe in the industry. And what I found is that actually the things that I think give me clarity quite often don't exist or are challenged on projects. So either I'm the outlier, or actually we've got some confusion in the industry, and that could be another provocation. In terms of starting point for me, and it links into what Adam was saying, but we really must start from a point of making whole life carbon decisions. And that seems to be a bit of a no-brainer. We need to consider our operational and our embodied carbon. But we also need to recognise, as we drive energy performance much lower in operation, that the embodied is becoming really, really significant. So it depends on the projects that you pick, but maybe some of the commercial projects we look at, the balance might be swinging more from 20-30% of that balance being operational to 70% or so being embodied. And just getting your head around the fact that how important embodied carbon is important. But I would challenge, or my kind of confusion point, is that I think those early decisions around this are not being balanced, they're not being addressed with rigour. And I think we could do more in that space. All of those early decisions we should look at in a holistic manner. If I now focus on the embodied carbon side of things, this is a fairly simple stepped approach, which I think you'll have seen. Often people use different words, but in principle, if you want to reduce your embodied carbon, you reuse stuff, you use less material, and then you specify well. That seems quite apparent, quite obvious. But what I'm seeing frequently is an argument around this, and I don't really understand why we need to be arguing about it, but there's an argument about kind of how much we can reuse or what we should be reusing. There's frequently kind of different advice out there in the market around, well, do we need to use less material? If we use more timber and we use certain sequestration figures, then surely it gives us a better embodied carbon answer. If we use hydroelectric steel, it doesn't matter how much steel we use, so therefore let's not worry about using less steel. I don't agree with those. I think you have to stick with that hierarchy and approach your way through it. In terms of the reuse side of this, I think it's pretty clear to me, and I'm not arguing with Adam's science-based targets point, but we need to take a little bit of the emotion out of the discussion. And I'm bound to say this as an engineer, but I think these need to be evidence-based decisions. That doesn't mean we ignore people in the evidence-based decisions, but we should be looking at the numbers of the decisions, and we should be kind of using that to guide what we do. And I think the industry has started to heavily politicise the decisions that we make. And if you take the evidence out of it, perhaps we'll make some incorrect decisions. Just a couple of examples that are on the slide of the sort of benefits of reuse, but also thinking about it by elements. So sometimes we just dramatically swing from reuse to new build, but often there's interim measures. There's partial refurb, there's elemental refurb. So 1FA, which was an original Arup Associates building, the new refurbishment of that, 90% of the central plant has been reused. And Triton, the new scheme that's just been delivered north of Euston Road, the facade has been repurposed, recycled and replaced back on that building. So we don't necessarily have to swing and politicise dramatically between one or the other. We can use an elemental approach. This is, for me, basics. If we're going to use less, then we need to know what we're trying to achieve. We need to have a carbon budget. In having a carbon budget, then it's good to understand by elements on the building how much makes up the embodied carbon totals. Is it roughly 45% of the building which is sub and superstructure? and 20% or so that's facade. And if you start to get those kind of metrics in place, you can make some informed early decisions. And that's an approach that I think we should be putting in place on all of our projects. But I would argue that the discussion around budgets and targets is becoming clouded, and we spend more time talking about what it is than actually setting a budget and going for it and trying to beat it. To use less is really clear to me. You've got to influence the early decisions. And this is 8 Bishopsgate, one of Shin's buildings, who's in the room with us today. And one of the interesting things about this building, the diagram you see in the middle is an early concept diagram for the scheme. And working with Wilkinson Eyre and the team, we kind of changed the way that the facade was put together. It sits within the same rights of light envelope, it sits within the same planning requirements, but that wall to floor ratio shifted from 0.6 to 0.48 through that early decision making. And that's about 5% of the overall building's embodied carbon. So just having a chance to play with the massing of the building, make some influential decisions, makes a really big deal. The building you're in now has around about 0.35 as a wall to floor ratio if you include the atria in that. So that gives you an indication that you're playing with around 10% of your embodied carbon just by looking at your wall to floor ratio. And Steve Watts is also in the room. I'm sure he'd support that there might also be some cost metrics which are helpful to go alongside that decision around wall to floor ratio. Again, to use less, work the carbon budget. Once you've got that budget, work it hard. So if you look at the column grids, this building is a 7.5 by 9 grid. I wonder if many of you noticed that when you came in. But just this is some sort of typical numbers from a scheme that we looked at recently, where if you firstly optimise the steelwork and for this on around a kind of 9 by 12 grid, you can make around 1.5% embodied carbon saving. If you reduce those grids from 9 by 12 to 9 by 9 or even 9 by 7.5, you can make another 7% saving. And then if you consider geometry, if you look at the use of kind of Ys or trees for columns, you can make a further saving. So you may be able to realise about a 10% total embodied carbon saving just by looking at the efficiency of geometry and the grids that you work with. Now, my kind of provocation on this slide is this frequent, and it's interesting that Peter mentioned this earlier, but often some of the things that we talk about maybe conflict with market expectations. So will a tenant turn up and say, I need a completely clear floor plan, I don't want any columns? How do we work that through? How do we have an informed discussion about what people really need? And I find buildings like this quite useful to have a real life example. You can go and walk around BCG's fit out, see how they fitted out the space. You can see how Arup have fitted out the space. You can see the kind of range of flexibility that people have within those solutions. But you can only start to convince people, I think, when you see stuff in real life. So then moving on to the kind of next step in the Edwards process is specify well. And I think for this was something that we've recently done on a scheme, and it's about sort of considering the column options. And this was a real surprise to me, and I've deliberately put this up there because this didn't match my initial assumption. Okay, so what we did is we looked at a tall building and we looked at what all of the different embodied carbon comparators were for different vertical load carrying solutions, different columns on the building. And if you look to the right, some steel reinforced concrete columns are actually showing us that they're the lowest overall embodied carbon for that building. And it was around about kind of 8% saving on the overall carbon budget, embodied carbon budget for that. But if you kind of step back from that, you kind of think steel with concrete, they're quite chunky. Is that going to be the lowest embodied carbon solution? And I didn't realise, and it was only when we put the evidence to it and we explored the options that we kind of came up with that as a solution. So I think that testing yourself and considering the options and exploring is absolutely crucial. And then linking the elemental impacts. I don't think it'd be a surprise to you as someone who's working for Arup that I'm going to say that linking multidisciplinary design I think is a good thing. But it's not company. This is not a company point. This is a general point about the industry. When we are designing, we tend to get passionate about our area, and I think a kind of a holistic embodied carbon approach makes us think about others and encourages us to think about others. So when we're putting a facade on a building, there's a couple of examples up there, but the range is from 0.7 kilonewtons a metre squared load on the facades on the left up to 3 kilonewtons facade load on the right. That's a big difference in terms of the loads on the foundations, the embodied carbon for the structure. And so just thinking about the other disciplines and the impact we're having on each other is absolutely crucial. The diagram on the right is just an example. Just think, we all love greenery on buildings. We love terraces. We love the fact that that's kind of people need to enjoy the spaces they're in. There's no point in doing what we do if they don't. But actually we can do simple things. We can optimise landscaping strategies so that it comes above columns. We can do stuff where we kind of keep the weight down. So just linking those elemental impacts is absolutely crucial. So I'll finish on this slide. So my provocation was, can we avoid confusion in our decision making, our carbon decision making? And I guess my challenge to you guys in the room and those online is, which side of this slide are you on? Are the projects that you're involved in, that you lead or you influence, are you seeing more of the phrases on the left, or are you seeing more of the phrases on the right? And my provocation is that we need to move to more of the phrases on the right.
Thank you, Jeremy. Lorna. I think it always reminds me, listening to Jeremy and others as well, how much we're in the infancy in terms of actually working out how we really embed carbon decision making in our projects. We've been kind of optimising this for the last couple of years, trying to undo 30 years worth of more conventional, you might say, thinking. Fascinating. Lorna.
Thank you. Obviously, we'd like to reiterate what everyone else has said about how brilliant it is to be in person, and also wonderful to see so many familiar, friendly, I hope, faces. So my provocation is, in order to achieve net zero, we need a flexible approach to our heritage assets. To put in figures, obviously heritage is a really important feature of our built environment. Everyone loves heritage buildings, but just to give some statistics in terms of how important all of this is. Starting on the right hand side, obviously heritage is hugely important to our economy. Millions and millions of visitors every year, billions to the economy, and supports a huge number of jobs. In terms of listed buildings, we have 500,000 in the UK alone, which represents 2% of stock. Most importantly, there's a lot of old buildings built pre-1919, which is a key date in terms of when methods of construction changed, and a huge amount of buildings also located in a huge number of conservation areas. Pre-1919 is also very relevant for domestic stock. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to shine a light on the domestic issue. I think many people in this room are very focused on big projects. I know we certainly are at our practice, but of course we all live somewhere. And the domestic issue is important because it accounts for a lot of our UK emissions. So the problem with historic stock in terms of performance is they don't perform very well. To give some data on this, the average UK home has an EPC band rating of D, and there's only 30% of UK homes that achieve EPC band C. That also means there's some quite serious issues in terms of damp and overheating, and percentage of homes that are actually classified as having health hazards. So pre-1919 homes, we're looking at 26.9% having health hazards. This then translates into some pretty shocking health statistics. So I think there's an argument that we need to do something purely on a health basis, if for no other reason. So in terms of fuel poverty, there's a huge amount of households that are in fuel poverty, 3.3 million to be precise. And of those, 88% are living in EPC band D or below. Unfortunately, that also translates into a huge number of deaths every year. There's also big issues with people having sleep disturbance due to noise issues, which obviously if you're living in a house that's got really poor single glazed windows, you're going to get a lot of noise issues. Also excess summer deaths and a huge number of children who carry inhalers due to damp issues. And as you can see, the cost of the NHS is enormous, billions of pounds every year, and also to the economy in terms of loss of productivity. So what is the strategy? What are the industry looking at to address this on a domestic front? So the UK Green Building Council have advocated that at the point of sale by 2028, all properties should be achieving EPC Band C. Letty have also got some really good guidance in terms of retrofit. So looking at these examples highlighted are for a typical terraced house in terms of the energy performance that we should be looking at. So 60 kilowatt hours for energy use intensity per year per metre squared. And that comes with a really stringent set of U values that you have to meet. So this all sounds good. However, and the really big challenge is the policy is really, really inconsistent. So the work that I've been doing at RSHP in terms of projects would lead me to believe that actually this is fine, we can do it. It's okay because the council is really supportive. So work that we've done at Hammersmith Civic Campus in Fulham and also at the British Museum, the council were really supportive of any fabric upgrades to help our energy performance, and you get a lot of interaction with Historic England and with case officers. However, when you move to a smaller scale, which is perhaps the bigger problem, you don't get as much interface with case officers and you probably get a more junior case officer. So this leads to a very, very conservative approach. It's obviously important that we protect the heritage, and there is a reason why people are cautious, because often historic buildings, they're non-standard materials, they're very different to each other, and they're designed to breathe. But we need to do something. This also obviously applies to later typologies of buildings that are designed to be adaptable and may need to be adapted in the future. So moving on to the case study, I'm not showing this as an example of my wonderful design skills, far from it. I'm using it to illustrate a challenge. So we live in Southwark. I live in a domestic house, obviously. It's grade 2 listed Georgian townhouse, 200 years old, representative of quite a common typology in London. My husband's also an architect, so we went into this with our eyes open. We knew what we were taking on. We bought it with EPC Band D, that was clear. We've also been able to look at what we use in terms of energy performance. It's about 160 kilowatt hours per year metre squared. I might say we're really stringent with the heating, so some people in this room will have seen me on Teams calls over the last 2 years looking like I'm going on a polar expedition. So our energy usage probably should be, or typically would be, more than that. We've also got some listed builder consent for some adaptations already, so we know what we can do, and we did a lot of pre-application discussion with them. So we have a really clear idea of what is possible and what is not. And I think this is quite interesting just in terms of illustrating what people would have to do to meet these targets. So it's things like adding internal and external insulation. The interior of my house is listed, so Southwark, very unlikely to say yes to that. Also, if you insulate externally, I think this figure is based on 100 mil, that is going to have a huge impact on the heritage significance. The other thing you can do is upgrade windows. The council will not have that. They're very, very conservative. They won't even let us change windows in areas where it's non-original and where you can't see it from the street. It's a very, very hard conservative line. The most sensible option to me would be to put in slimline double glazing in areas that you can't see from the street, or secondary glazing, which doesn't have any impact from the outside. Of course, we could also look at renewables, so PVs, and if we are able to upgrade the fabric, then we could look at air source heat pumps. But I think this really well illustrates that it's a massive challenge. And it's not just a problem for me, it's a problem for many other people. So the industry targets, I think, are near impossible in a situation like this, unless we can find a common ground. So if we can find a common ground, meet in the middle, find something that works, there's some potential for some really, really good savings. So the figure on the left is the amount of carbon that we could save per year if all listed buildings and historic dwellings in conservation areas were upgraded. You know, that's 30% of the UK's sixth carbon budget per year. It's a huge amount. You know, it's a bigger slice of the pie than the stock would lead you to believe. it also is an opportunity to create a huge number of jobs, save the NHS billions, and also enable people to save a huge amount of energy on their bills. It's a real challenge, and it's something that we need to address. So just some ideas of how we could do that. We need to review policy. There needs to be some joined up thinking. We need an integrated approach, and this needs to be both at national level and at local level. We need to address the skills gap. So that is conservation officers, it's architects, it's engineers. It is the people who are going to do the work. Many house builders, many house owners approach a builder in the first instance. A lot of them are not trained in how to do this. Most of all, we need to share knowledge. So we need to share what works. We need more examples of case studies, and we need to raise awareness. A lot of people are not even aware that this is a problem, and then they need to do something. We can also promote what does work from a policy level in terms of local councils who have got policies that work should share them. There are things like local listed builder consent orders to look at blanket consents for things like PVs on roof, pilot projects. Costs is also an issue, obviously, it's a big barrier, and we need to make sure there are things like grants for social housing. And I guess my provocation to this room, and this is also relevant to non-domestic stock, you know, we're all retrofitting more, and it's relevant to all historic and heritage buildings, is we really need to encourage innovation. We need to be doing more R&D and more living labs, that kind of thing, so that we can monitor what does work. And I think as a whole, we all need to focus on this more, because if we don't, it's going to remain a problem, and you're going to be getting many more people sticking themselves to the M25. Okay, that's me.
Thank you. Thanks, Lorna. I mean, I think it is interesting listening to Lorna, just reflecting on, you know, when you zoom out of the kind of central London commercial market that a lot of us spend a lot of time working in, actually the whole challenge and that route to net zero starts to look very different.
Does this work on both? Oh dear, sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Thank you all for coming. I'm incredibly nervous. I quite like Teams because I can't see anyone. But anyway, here we go. So my provocation is that in order to achieve net zero, we need to adopt an adaptable plug-and-play approach to our buildings, not a flexible one. What I mean by that is by extending the life of a building chassis, in other words, its superstructure, substructure, and often its facade, that improves its embodied carbon impact. In other words, the embodied carbon invested in the building is valuable for longer. So I'm a building services engineer, so obviously I like plants and envelopes and all that kind of thing. But I believe that adapting an adaptive plug-and-play approach to our buildings will help us achieve net zero, not only the plant, etc. A snappier description of this is thinking outside the box, and you'll see why I'm talking about that in a minute. The approach can extend the life of existing buildings as well as new buildings, and it can also support change to existing buildings to improve building performance and avoid the danger of stranded assets, which we're beginning to see in the market in London already. So, thinking outside the box. This is not a new idea, obviously. Here are two famous examples of thinking outside the box, well known to some of the people in this room. Plug-and-play buildings which have adaptability at their heart. That is what they were built for and designed for. How do we apply this theory now? This is a typical building fitted out with all the usual energy reducing measures, shading, PVs on the roof, that kind of stuff. But what if it was an ALETI aligned commercial office building, mixed mode, with air source heat pumps providing heating and limited cooling? This could be the default usage for the life of this building, for example. To achieve the envelope performance needed, this is probably a new build or a building that's just had a significant refurbishment. The operational and embodied carbon for this building, designed well, would be aligned to net zero. So why aren't all our new buildings like this? Because they're not. So the market can be a barrier at the moment to providing net zero office space. Tenants want to lease net zero buildings, or they say they do, and a lot of them have made commitments to do so. But the impact of lower small power provision is not translating yet to BCO or developer briefs, not yet. It isn't necessarily even translating to the tenant briefs, despite the fact they've told us they want a net zero building. Small power is a whole discussion on its own. I won't go into that. We'd be here all day. And I don't know the answers. But it hasn't been helped by the lack of measured small power usage evidence over the last couple of years while we've had COVID, which has been a time of sort of transition in how we use our IT, whether we're thin clients, you know, all of that stuff, as well as the move to laptops, etc. Ian's looking interested. I'll grab you afterwards, Ian. A typical building designed to BCO brief is therefore likely to require mechanical cooling and ventilation, certainly for part of the year. A plug-and-play approach can support this increase only if it's needed. In other words, should we be allowing for this adaptability on the first day, or should we, sorry, I beg your pardon, I'll press the wrong button there, or should we just only add what we need when we know we need it? Do we wait? Do we be brave? But there are other things that this building chassis could do. Laboratories have demonstrated their importance and value in recent years, and careful and considered design allows certain laboratory types to be accommodated in many commercial buildings. Floor-to-floor heights, vibration and servicing require careful thought to limit the embodied carbon impact of building for science. But carefully considering which areas to enable and using an adaptive plug-and-play solution can result in another building use, extending that chassis life, which is a good thing. And maybe in the future, there will be a shift to converting from commercial to office. Again, adaptive plug-and-play approaches can allow this, and of course this approach is not restricted to new build. Here's an example of an adaptive outside-the-box addition to an existing building to support a change of use. But as I showed earlier, this approach is not new. I'm going to finish by revisiting these buildings which I love. The Lloyd's building and the Pompidou Centre. These examples were designed for adaptation. They should be the poster buildings for this type of approach, but they're now viewed through a heritage lens, meaning that ongoing adaptation requires permission. This should not put us off an adaptable plug-and-play approach, but we need a route to net zero, I agree with Lorna, through this conservation maze. That's me done.
Thank you very much, Anne. Okay, so Q&A time. I'm going to pick up a couple of questions in the chat, and then I think we've got some roving microphones. Yes, people nodding at me. Okay, so get your questions ready. So this one was anonymous, but somebody asked in the chat, is the EPC fit for purpose? And I might just expand that slightly. Just to what extent do we think the way that we measure the performance of buildings, or the way that the industry defines the expectations for performance, are holding us back? How much do we need to go around unpicking the standards that we measure our buildings by?
Okay, I'll start on that. So it needs to be overhauled, is my personal view. I think in terms of how accurate they are is very much under debate. I think there's been some analysis that shows that up to 60% of them can be pretty wrong. And also, you know, in terms of the complexity of what you're measuring, it's really hard to actually, again, everything needs to be evidence and database. It's really hard to actually get the data that you need to make it a meaningful analysis.
I'm going to pick up on that. I agree. That's the first thing. I do agree. We do need to overhaul them. I was told off by someone in Arup, who's in this room actually, when I said they're rubbish. They don't do what they're supposed to be doing. And I was reminded that actually they have been doing what they've been supposed to be doing for a long time. We've kind of managed to, using EPCs, to get our energy down to a point where it's now a useless measure. Because we're at the kind of pointy end, the difficult and sharp end, where every little thing needs to be measured quite carefully to see what its effect on the actual building performance should be. So now is the time to rehaul.
Okay, and I might come to Adam and maybe just kind of broaden it out slightly if we think about the way that we measure embodied carbon, neighbours, things like BCO that kind of has a sort of, you know, very widely used industry definition. What are your thoughts on standards and the way that we need to approach standards generally?
Well, I think having standards is better than having no standards, so I think you're right the EPC situation is that it's better to have them than not have them. They've got people thinking over years about how buildings perform, so that's quite a good start. I think we're on the same uphill learning curve on embodied carbon. A bit like on your annual tax bill, the government a few years ago started telling you how your tax was spent as a bar chart. I think we should, I think adopting an increasingly communicative way of dealing with these things for people like food labels do is a good thing.
Jeremy, thoughts?
I quite like having clear standards. I think my comment would be how we get to them and how we measure what goes into them is where the huge variability, sometimes lack of integrity is. And so maybe an encouragement around measuring with integrity to a set target would be where I would focus.
Cool. Okay, let's go to questions in the room. Anybody want to answer a question? I've got Peter, go on. Let's start with Peter. Go on. If you want to just say who you are, Peter, for the purpose
Hi,
of people.
Peter Rogers, Lipton Rogers. Firstly, congratulations on this space. It's a huge improvement on the old dungeon next door. And I think it works really well, so my compliments. First of all, I completely agree with Jeremy. We should use less materials. I mean, whether it's nothing to do with carbon, we simply shouldn't waste. I think that society has become very wasteful in its approaches. I think the other thing, and it picks up a bit on the standards point, is we do need focus to drive us down. And the standards are always behind the curve. I mean, the day they're made, they're out of date. But at least it does help drive us. And the whole carbon agenda is driving innovation, which I think is fundamental. Question for me is, aren't all the figures we're putting up on the board wrong? Simply, as we move forward, less carbon content, but all our predictions are based on today's carbon content of materials. So most of our focus, I think, is to a large extent mathematically incorrect. And I think we should be looking much more at today's carbon. We should just simply reduce the amount of carbon we use now. I wouldn't worry too much about the future, because if we reduce it now, that will drive changes in materials. I mean, the work that's going on steel, the work that's going on with cement additives, cement replacements, will end up eventually with having very low carbon embodied. We've still got to pull the steel out of the ground, which is why we should use less, because that's wrong. But I think in general, we do need to be careful of the targets we're using, because I just think the embodied carbon numbers are simply incorrect.
Okay. Jeremy, do you want to start with that?
I'll take
Thoughts
that
on
lovely question, Peter. I think that, I do agree with you, but I'm going to put a but with it. I think what I was trying to communicate, I suppose, was if you take a first principles approach, you get some good answers. And if you take the point around using less, if we use less of something first, hopefully that will make a difference. And then if specification improves with time and gets better, then we should still be on the right journey. So I think all of us struggle to slightly predict the future, but if we take the sort of first principles approach, then we should still end up at a good place. And I think that would be how I would answer it, sort of go for the first principles before we argue about the numbers.
Okay. Anyone on the other side want to come in on that?
Well, I just totally agree with Peter that I think all the numbers are wrong. And I think that's part of the anxiety of people publicising net zero buildings before they've got there, is that people define net zero differently, and secondly, the numbers need another 10 years of maturity.
I'll third that. So from an architect's point of view, the numbers are used as a yardstick for people not doing well, and people become very, very focused on the end number. But of course, we're always comparing ourselves against a benchmark. So in order to reduce, you need to know what that benchmark is, which comes to what you're saying is actually, where are we now so that we can improve? And until you understand that, you can't do better.
Just join in for the sake of it, but not really. But so I was just thinking that the idea that Jeremy said about using the whole life carbon perspective, though, we have to use something. And so if we are comparing, for example, taking your point earlier, Adam, about, you know, DGUs with opening windows or not, that kind of thing, they're useful as a comparator. I think we're all still learning. I think we're all saying the same thing. There's so far to go on this. And part of my thing about keeping kind of light on your feet, adapting to changes, only putting in what you need when you need it, is a response to that. I think we're probably all agreeing with each other. That's a good question.
Okay, let's move on. I'm going to try and sort of bring together a number of questions in the chat. So there's a question from Adam Smith in the chat. I'm assuming that's not you, Adam.
Hijack my LinkedIn.
That's how you did that without moving your hands. Anyway, so asking about buildings as materials banks, asking about reusability, and I think there was another comment in the chat further down. So I'm going to try and bring that together. So to what extent do you think we ought to be designing buildings for long life, loose fit, or to what extent should we be designing buildings to be demountable? So are we focusing on continuing building use or material level reuse? Where do you think our focus should be, and how do we find the right balance?
Well, I think we can easily start with reuse. I think as the examples that Anne showed earlier, there are some buildings that are already being designed to be reused. Whether that's been implemented in practice or not is quite untested. I think there are some examples. So fabrics being one, which is the steelwork for Broadgate being reused. But in theory, and certainly in the world of BIM, you know, we could do material banks because everyone knows what the structural system is, you know the properties of that steelwork, and if you want to reuse that from a building that is dismantled, then we should be able to do that. But obviously, materials banks, quite a complex issue in terms of where do they get put, how do they get paid for, and it needs some kind of support at government level. But I fundamentally believe that we can certainly design buildings that can be dismantled and reused.
I'm going to mildly disagree with you. I think it's a fantastic aspiration. I think certain buildings it's a very appropriate for, but I think it's very difficult to predict the future of how people want to build buildings in the future. And so if you spend an awful lot of effort and money and materials in making things dismantleable, it might be in vain. I think my view and that of my colleagues is that we should really be designed for long life, loose fit, and actually potentially a little bit more embodied carbon to make that happen is potentially embodied carbon well spent. I think the material bank aspect that's very interesting is in the fit out and in the M&E, where there is, as we all know, huge wastage, even at PC, with tenants coming in, but also in relatively short lease lengths that people want to come in and change everything. The challenge, I think, for us designers and developers is creating fit outs that people don't want to change for a long time and can reconfigure.
And I'm going to agree with that. I think there's probably room for both. I think there's no reason to do one or the other. I think both of them have their place depending on the type of building. And on the fit out point, let's not fit them out. Let's do VR.
Okay, let's go back to questions in the room. Yes, go. Yeah, if you could just say who you... sorry, one at the front, and then who else had their hand up? If you just put... Oh, Joe, okay. Yeah, just say who you are if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, Lucy Homer from Lend-Lease. Really great event, so it's really nice to be here in person too. I'm a big advocate of a really interesting topic, and I think lots of really interesting points have been made. One of the things that I'm a big advocate of is being able to do things that are within your sphere of influence. And one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about for a little while is the impact, and especially in commercial buildings, of BCO. And I know there's a lot of people, I don't really know who's behind me, but there are certainly people that I can see forwards who are sort of involved in BCO. And I wonder how many of our buildings are over-designed because they're designed to BCO standards. And I think that there's probably enough people in this room that we could probably very simply change something very powerfully with not a lot of effort. And I just thought what people thought about that.
Okay, I'm going to go around the panel, and then I might just pick on someone in the audience who I know has a strong view on this subject. Adam, thoughts on opportunities and challenges around BCO?
Yeah, well, Lucy, I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of Well, I think we should remember the BCO guide as a guide, not a standard, and I think sadly that the agency market regard it as a standard. We're all intelligent people. We should be interpreting the guide, what's appropriate. That said, I do know the technical and the committees at the BCO are trying to make edits that make that a bit clearer, in pursuit of offering people the opportunity to make some of those more judicious decisions themselves.
I'll chip in as well. There's quite a lot in the BCO which is worthy of a bit of criticism, but there's also aspects of the BCO which don't even get used very well. So if you just take live loading in a building for a number of years, the BCO guidance has been 2.5 plus 1 as a live load, and yet the industry has typically delivered 3 or 3.5 plus 1. So there are aspects where they've kind of tried to push the game forward, and there are probably aspects where they're a little bit behind. And I think where I could see the BCO being the most help at the moment would be on providing the strong guidance around small power loads, and giving tenants the kind of confidence that if leaner small power loads are provided, that they could, that they would be happy in those buildings and they would be comfortable in those buildings. So I think there's a little bit of both. Give them credit in some areas, and Benji Lesser's in the room. I'm sure he'd have a view on BCO.
Benji, do you want to come in on this?
Okay, Benji Lesser, Derwent, London. I'll wear 2 hats actually, BCO as well. Congratulations on brilliant event, excellent subject, and I think we're all very happy to be here in this great building. Well done to Arup and everyone involved. So, just picking up a few things. The numbers, whether they're wrong or right, they've been able to tell a story over the last 10. The reason we're in the room is because we have a certain belief in the numbers being 50, 60, 70% accurate, able to tell a story. We're here, we're trying to find the true path to net zero, and a meaningful path. I think we need this. Everyone in this room has a responsibility to take those numbers further, and actually it's the data that is now far more important than the numbers. And if we can use that data and model with that data and show ourselves, the suppliers of space, the story, but more importantly, it's the users, our customers, the occupiers of space. If we can whole massive sector, not only commercial occupiers, but also domestic occupiers, but if we use that data and tell the story and show the modelling, we can actually show that through evidence that actually they are every way that we thought people were occupying space has actually proved to be wrong. They're actually occupying space using far less power, using far less of all the sort of technical criteria which we thought were benchmarks, were good benchmarks and protected, I suppose, the supplier end of the industry. If we can actually show with that data that actually we can design those buildings to be absolutely appropriate because we know now how they're occupied, we know the loads required, consumption is used, we can actually persuade people that we can design a completely new generation of building that is far more appropriate for real use. And this is where I'm going to put my BCO hat on. The BCO has a lot of catching up to do. It's far too slow, far behind the curve on this. I think the people in this room and outside of the room in the industry, at the sort of top end of the industry, understand these concepts, and the BCO need to move very, very fast in the next few months, in order for us to make proper changes in the industry that are supported by the BCO. I think, my view is the BCO should be there for the industry. It is of the industry. It shouldn't be leading the industry down the wrong path. So we should be sort of shouting loudly at BCO events and conferences, whatever, to actually make sure that those changes are made, so that actually the guidance is far stronger and far more appropriate for the next generation of building. And if we don't do it now, with buildings that are on the drawing board for delivery into 2030, we really will have missed the boat. So it's a kind of call to everyone here and everyone in the industry to actually bang the table, shout loudly that actually the data is important. We need to educate the industry and beyond the industry, the occupiers more importantly, so that actually we do end up designing the appropriate buildings for the next generation.
Can I chip in on that?
Yes,
I totally agree. And I think the problem that we have at the moment is the lack of data. Because COVID sort of shut us down as we were all transitioning to, as I say, no servers in buildings, etc., or less servers in buildings, but also getting rid of desk-based computers, etc., and moving to laptops. We have changed. And so my call to the industry is give us your data. Let's find places that are fully occupied and let's measure them so that we can actually build that bank of data that we can move forward. Because I think that's what's lacking just at the moment to help us all move in that direction.
Okay, we are at time, so I'm just going to give I'm going to take that as your closing remarks, Anne, if that's all right.
That's fine.
Let's look at the panel. Are there any kind of final kind of summation comments you'd like to anything you haven't said that you wanted to say? Now's the chance.
I'll add one. So in terms of the big challenges, I think one thing that we need to do as an industry, both for domestic and commercial and other types of typologies, is we need to address the skills gap. So in order to achieve all of this, there's an enormous amount of work to be done in the measuring, in the data, but also at a policy level. So conservation officers, planning policy in terms of supporting actually making these things happen. It's all well and good having the vision, but actually having the people who can help us make it happen is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and a huge challenge. I completely agree. Adam?
No, thank you for having me. I think data, bridging the gaps, and collaborating on the big challenges are the key themes.
Jeremy?
I think I'll finish with, I've been brought up in a company and with clients that give you a kind of equal voice and bring people in the room who are informed from all aspects of the industry to make good decisions. And I suppose with all of this topic, I'd kind of encourage the thinking around how do you create an environment to make good decisions, and recognise that, because actually I think that is the way forward rather than pulling each other apart.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you to our panellists, Jeremy, Anne, Lorna and Adam. Finally, we can actually ask people to give them a round of applause. Let's do that, shall we? Well done, guys. And thanks also to our comms team and our FM team who've kind of made all this happen in the background. It does seem to have worked online and in person simultaneously, which I had my doubts about, I have to be honest. Thank you all for joining us in person. Thanks to everybody. We had a big audience online. I'm sorry, there were lots of great questions online that we didn't manage to get to. If we didn't get to your in-person questions, there's more coffee and snacks. You're more than welcome to hang around and ask us one-to-one. The next event will be the last week in May, so we'll be in the same format here in London and online, and we'll be looking more at existing estates, decarbonisation of existing estates. So please look out for the emails and the LinkedIn posts, and I do hope you can join us for that too. Thanks very much, everyone.